welcome to HRM 300. This is Kevin Matthews. I'm the professor for this class for fall 2018, and the video that we're going to be doing today is going to be on the selection process. So as we kind of talked about in the beginning, and I know I've said this over and over again, and I'm going to say it again, think of the diagram that we're dealing with here, and the first part of that diagram is that we have on the base level of our building that we're building, it's going to be the strategic management plan. On top of that, we've got diversity, and then we have sort of these pillars that we've kind of talked about in the past that we're basically going to sort of form the structure of our building. And one of the things that I'll say about all of this, as we talk about recruiting, recruiting is a very exciting thing to do and something that I cherish to do every day when I was working as a recruiting manager in the United States Navy. But, nothing makes somebody feel happier than hearing the words, "You're in." And that's something that we always enjoy. I always enjoyed telling somebody when and I always enjoyed seeing it. I mean, you could just see the light in their eyes that basically says, "You're in, you got selected." And I remember that day when I was selected for the United States Navy. I still remember getting the email with the PDF attachment. Back then PDFs were kind of a new thing. You got the letter that basically said, "Hey, you're in. You're going to report to OCS on this date. Get ready. Get lock and load. Let's go." That's maybe a different feeling than you're going to get, but I will tell you, the day that I got the phone call that I was going to be hired by the Big Four that hired me, that was a pretty impressive day too. And so we're going to talk about selection now. Selection, we're talking about it primarily from the perspective of a recruiting selection. However, selection doesn't happen just in recruiting. Okay, we don't just choose people to join the firm. We're going to be choosing people for promotions. We're going to be choosing people to partake in special programs that are going to exist within the company. We're going to be choosing people to do various things within the organization that could enhance or hurt their career depending on the choices that are made. A lot of the processes that we're going to talk about here with selection are similar processes that are going to take place when we're talking about selecting within the firm for something to take place. And so I don't want you to kind of think of this as selecting of the recruited candidate and that's all where it applies. This definitely has some application in other areas. So in this section, we talk about the interview. You've sat there and they give you kind of an opening story where they kind of talk about this, and I'm sure all of us in this class have attended a job interview at one point in our lives, and if you haven't, I'll tell you it's it's definitely a skill you want to hone before you go in and do it. I've worked at 5 companies, including my own, since leaving the military. Before I left the military, I attended many as I was leaving the military, I attended many job interviews. And then every time I swapped from one company to the next, I attended several interviews for each one of those companies. And then, before I went into the military, I had done a lot of job interviews too. And I've done a wide range of interviews. So I've done panel selections. I've done one-on-one interviews. I've done behavioral interviews. I mean, there's different types of things, and I'm talking mostly as me, the person who's participating in the interview, as the interviewee, but I've also done interviews as I've been working to select people. And as I run my own company right now, I'm in the process of hiring. So this is a very, very relevant topic for me right now. And I want to work very hard to make sure I make the good selection. And of course, some people, and think about it from this way. I know all of you are going to try to graduate from this program. The first thing you want to do is go out and get that nice job. But once you become, if you move into the HR field, once you become the HR manager, you're going to start realizing that there's just as much pressure on us to do the right thing as there is about you getting that selection. So, because making a poor selection can really hurt the organization. And I could tell you a lot of horror stories, but unfortunately that would blow the time to 3 hours for this video. So I wanted to do that. They kind of, I'm just going to start talking about the chapter. The first thing they talk about is, the interview, and they give you kind of an overlay of what an interview is. Like I said, if you've been through an interview, you know exactly what's going on and all that sort of stuff. So, so the first thing that we're going to do is in this section, we're going to talk about the selection process. And so the selection process is where we're going to talk about with the learning objective to be able to name and discuss the steps in the selection process. So once they talk about how if you developed your recruiting plan, recruited people, now you have plenty of people to choose from, now the selection process begins. And that's kind of what ends up happening. You kind of throw this huge net out there. You throw this huge net to the ocean, and you start saying, hey, I'm going to catch all these fish. But what ends up happening is, maybe you work for, the guy who supplies the sushi market over in Tokyo, Japan. They want high quality fish, right? And so that's kind of my analogy that you have with this. And especially if you've ever worked in an HR place that has automated recruiting systems, for example, like Monster. Monster, does a lot of, they do a lot of keyword searches for people. You'll put out a job advertisement for something and you'll have, 3,000 people apply for it, of which 2,000 people have absolutely no business applying for it. But you still have to read through, you would, if you didn't have the system, you'd have to read through those 2,000 resumes, which is impossible. There's no way you could do it. Doing the 1,000 that might qualify for the position is difficult too. So that's why they came up with this technology to look for keywords and kind of shorten down the expanse. But the problem, of course, that brings out is, what if you're qualified for the job but you don't use the right keywords? Well, that's where that can kind of land you into some trouble. So they kind of talk about, the cost of, hiring somebody. The U.S. Department of DOL statistics puts it at about $40,000. And it depends on what kind of a job you're looking for. If you're talking about, hiring at the local McDonald's, I mean, it basically takes, 10 to 15 minutes of the manager's time plus, some other things that go into that, developing of the, developing of the job application and various other things. It probably doesn't take as much money to hire for one of those positions, and it shouldn't, because the job doesn't pay as much. But if you're going to hire somebody to do a $300,000 job for you, you're probably going to put a lot of emphasis in that interview, and really put some time into it. So, so the selection process consists of these 5 distinct aspects: criteria development, application and the resume review, interviewing, test administration, and then making the offer. And we're going to talk about each one of those as we go into this chapter. So criteria development, where all individuals involved in the hiring process should properly be trained in the steps for interviewing, including developing criteria, reviewing resumes. And this is really, I would say HR people and managers should really get this training. Now, periodically what's going to end up happening is that you're going to decide, hey, we're going to be interviewing for this position. So what we'd like to do is we're going to go to the department itself, and we're going to grab a couple of people who actually work there, sit down and talk to them. Those kind of people, you probably want to give them some initial training, just, probably more about EEO matters and things of that nature. But, specific interview techniques and specific interview, methods probably is not as important for them as it is, just to sit down and have a conversation and figure out, is this somebody I really want working with me? But I do think that EEO training is very important in order to do that. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to develop your criteria, and you should have already done some of that already when you did the job analysis and the job description. And then you're going to do your criteria that you're going to say, hey, look, out of this pool of 50 candidates, every one of them has a degree, so we're not going to worry about the degree as a candidate selection. All of them have a degree that qualifies. Let's say that. And then you're going to go to your preferred selection characteristics. Okay, so, and if all of them have the preferred degree, then you're just not going to worry about it. And see, and it might kind of sound like, well, duh. But that's not as intuitive as you might think, because, you know, when somebody's going through the resume, if you know that everybody meets minimum criteria before they start going through a lot of the initial processes, it can really cut down on time, which of course time is money. And some of the ways that we actually do that is when people actually apply, have them apply through a website, and it's going to ask them a series of specific questions. If they can't answer the questions correctly, their resume is not even going to be considered. So that actually really helps out in order to be able to do that. Application and resume review. You know, once criteria has been developed, application should be reviewed. People have different methods of going through the process, but there's computer programs that can help you, and we've kind of talked a little bit about that. You know, my recommendation always is, you know, I like everyone takes 10 resumes home. They come back after and they choose their one or two that they absolutely love. And then they fight for, you know, they say, this is the person I think it ought to be. Then you take those other 10 resumes, and then you take those resumes and then you hand them to other people, and then they go home and then they come back and decide who they're going to do. And that usually will get you some candidates that are going to be really happening. And that's, you know, I call that the push-pull method, which is very helpful in order to help select those individuals. So interviewing, after the HR manager and the manager have determined the applications meet the minimum criteria, should be selecting people for interviews. Oftentimes what ends up happening is with this, you know, you're probably going to narrow down, say, 150 applicants down to probably about 20 to 30, okay? From 20 to 30, you're then going to take a look at them and you're going to say, okay, of the 20 and 30, these are the people that we really want to focus on because they have, you know, they have something that we really want. It doesn't hurt for you to have a pool of 20 that you can pull from, because, you know, things happen. You know, you send out a request for somebody to come do an interview and they come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, I've already gotten another job offer, and I'm going to go ahead and go with that. Other people, you know, they get sick. Other people, you know, something comes up and they can't do it. Family emergencies, all that sort of stuff. So it doesn't hurt to have backups when you're doing that. How many you need, it depends on you. It depends on the job that you're applying for. You know, there's some people that take this process very seriously, and there's other people who do not take it seriously at all. So you want to make sure that you have plenty enough that you don't run out of potentially good people, and then you're kind of looking at around and saying, okay, we're going to choose the worst of two evils, choose the best of two evils, which is not something that you want to do. Test administration, you could have different types of tests. They talk about drug tests, physical tests, personality tests, cognitive tests. Background checks also, reference, you have credit reports, that gets mentioned there too. And then step 5, which is making the offer, and that's where you kind of talk a little bit about you're going to make that, you know, make the offer. Usually nowadays it's delivered in a formalized letter that says this is the salary we're going to offer you. In addition to that, we're going to offer you a wide range of benefits. Sometimes the offer letter will include the list of the benefits, sometimes it won't. I always recommend that it does, because you want people to really buy into it. And I believe that, you know, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the compensation and benefits chapter in chapter 6. But the total rewards concept, I think, is something that sorely gets overlooked, especially if you're going to be an organization that wants to do what I would call compensation lagging, benefits leading. Then you want to put your best foot forward and say, look, maybe, you know, we're going to give you the salary, which we realize that in the market it's competitive. Of course, we never say that our salary is below average. We say it's competitive. However, you know, something else that we offer for this is top of the line health insurance, top of the line fringe benefits package, top of the line daycare that you can put your child in while you're here at work, things of that nature, in order to make things go better for them. One of the things I really like, they have the figure 5.2. In this section, we're going to talk about criteria development and resume review. And so, you know, the 3 learning objectives that they have here is going to be able to explain why criteria development is important and part of the selection process, give examples of criteria that can be developed, and then describe the advantages and disadvantages of internal and external candidates. So, and they talk about before beginning a review of the resumes, must have a clear idea of the person they want for the position. And again, you should have that if you've already done your job analysis and your job description development. That should not be a problem. Again, you make sure that that's taken care of, and that should have been taken care of before you're even, when you're even doing your interviews, because not interviews, but when you start your recruitment process. That's just something that I go for. This is where they talk about the KSAOs. The KSAOs are basically knowledge, skills, abilities, and other personality characteristics. The federal government uses KSAOs a lot. In fact, if you take a look at any federal government job application, they're going to talk about the the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, and then other personality characteristics that they require in order to do that. And they use the Department of Veterans Affairs as a good example. Probably one of the only ones that's still hiring right now. I know that government hiring has slowed down significantly in recent years. So they talk about criteria development consideration. So HR professionals develop criteria for hiring as well as the interview questions. Allows for a streamlined process and all that stuff. So and you can walk into an interview. There's what I call the the formal interview, and then the informal interview, where they talk about, the formal interview is kind of where you have a sheet of questions that you're going to ask every single candidate. And some HR people like that, because then what it does is that it takes 10 candidates that are here, they've all been asked the exact same questions, and they've all delivered responses to them. And so that really helps out to, kind of compare apples to apples. So because if I start asking these 3 people a set of questions, and then I swap to different questions for these 3, and then for these other 4, I have, a completely third set of questions, or it's completely ad hoc. It's really hard for me to sit down and say, I like this person, or I don't like that person, or whatever, because it's, you need that. So formal can sometimes be good. Sometimes you want informal though. You keep candidates on their feet. If they know they're getting a specified, list of questions, sometimes they'll be able to prepare for those. They'll be prepared for those ones, because I know interview coaches like to help people with those types of typical questions. But it doesn't hurt to throw a curveball in there every now and then to get somebody thinking, yeah, I hadn't really prepared an answer for that one. That's how you can definitely test somebody's ability to think on their feet. Which is always kind of nice to know. And they talk about, the benefits of setting the criteria ahead of time, and so on and so forth. And then we get down to the subject of validity and reliability. And this is kind of important. It's not just important for how we do things within the HR field, but it's also important if you go on to further study. So if you want to talk about validity and reliability, we talk about that in tests, especially when we get into research. And so if you ever get into a master's program that requires researching, or if you get into a doctoral program, validity and reliability are two very important key topics. And so the validity talks, how useful the tool is to measure the person's attributes for the job's opening. A tool may include all the following: resume scanning, reference checks, work samples, credit reports, biographical information blanks, weighted application forms, blah, blah, blah. And then biographical information blanks are a useful part of the application. It's a series of questions about a person's history that may have shaped his or her behavior. I've never actually had to use one of these before. They sound interesting. I hopefully... it's something I'm going to look into as like I said, I'm hiring people, but I think that's a great idea, because there's somebody once said that we are nothing if not for a summation of all of our experiences, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And so it's good to have the series of questions about a person's history that might have shaped their behavior. Reliability refers to the degree in which other selection techniques yield similar data over time. So for example, if you ask the same question in every interview, every applicant for a project management position, the right answer always yields similar positive results. And so they kind of talk a little bit about that. So validity and reliability are going to be two things that you're going to have to consider as you're going into the interview process. Fit issues. It includes not only its right technical education and experience, but also the team culture. I think that's something that oftentimes gets overlooked. You know, a lot of the bigger organizations, they give you Facebook as an example, or Zappos or Amazon. They've got ways to do that kind of measurement that small guys like myself just don't have. And so, you know, but the good news about, you know, my company is that I have no culture. It's just me. So it's, you know, over time, you know, as I start hiring people, that culture is going to develop, and the way we do things is going to be sort of more solidified as it grows. Reviewing resumes. Well, once you develop the criteria, you can do the review process. Again, I like the, you know, of 4 or 5 people, take 10 home, bring it back, choose 2 or 3 of your favorites, and then people take 2, you know, to the resumes home again to choose 2 or 3 of your favorites. It's a little bit of a long process, but I think it can be really good because there's just some people that are just going to float to the top, and it really helps out a lot. It's something that I've used that's been very helpful. And so they're talking about, okay, you know, and this is where they kind of get into disparate impact. And I'm kind of glad that they brought this term up at this point. But I've kind of mentioned this in previous videos, and I've talked about this before. Disparate impact is sort of the it's unintended discrimination against a protected group through the use of a particular requirement. That's not fully what disparate impact is, but that's how disparate impact can happen. Okay, so for example, you know, and I talked about it in the recruiting video, and then also in the diversity video where we talked about hiring a restaurant manager. So I say I'm going to hire a restaurant manager, and I want the restaurant manager to have a 4-year degree. Okay. Here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, we have a pretty diverse population, but if I take people without 4-year degrees versus people with 4-year degrees, just the 4-year degree, and that's it. And I take a, you know, and we'll just use race right now because I think it's easiest to follow. And we take a racial composition of the people without degrees versus the composition of the people with degrees, we're going to see differences. Okay, and that could actually unintentionally create a situation where we unintentionally hire somebody, you know, without fully considering somebody who's fully qualified for it. And where this kind of comes into a bit of a problem for you is that you know, you could have somebody who doesn't get selected for an interview that basically says, look, I've been working in restaurants for 10 years, you don't select me for this position. Now, here's the thing, in restaurants, this happens all the time, so most people probably won't think much of it. But periodically, you're going to get that one person who says, look, you're not selecting me for an interview when I'm fully qualified to do this with everything except for the bachelor's degree. Why are you requiring this bachelor's degree? And so that can cause some issues where you have that disparate impact. And then, like I said, it can be challenged in court, so you want to make sure that you get everything that's taken care of. One of the other things they talk about here is hiring internal versus external candidates. Internal candidates, you know, so an internal candidate is someone who already works in the organization. External is outside the organization. You know, and there's a really good process that you can use with this if you decide that you want to hire internal candidates versus external candidates. I used to work at it used to be, oh gosh, how did they start off? They started off as by the time they got to me and I was hired into it, it was the DoubleTree, but I think now they're gobbled up by somebody. I think that property right now is a Hilton by now. But essentially, the way that they did it when I was at DoubleTree is that they had this internal site that you could go to that basically would list out all the positions that were being looked for. And what they would do is that they would post it to those sites before they would post it outside the organization. And the reason is that sometimes what ends up happening is you have somebody who's working, say, for example, in housekeeping, who doesn't want to do housekeeping anymore. And they said, hey, you know, you're hiring for the restaurant? I'd love to work in the restaurant. Can I please transfer to the restaurant? And if the person's been a hard worker and a good person the whole time, why would you deny an opportunity to somebody like that? Now, yeah, it's going to take some time to train them up, but guess what? You don't have to go through the hiring process with that person. You don't have to fill out all the forms that are necessary with that person in terms of, like W-4s, I-9s, all that stuff. All that stuff's taken care of. And that's just a small smidgen of what you're dealing with. That person doesn't have to attend initial orientation training because they've already been orientated to the organization. And then here's the other thing that's really cool about it. Cross-training into different fields actually ends up getting it to where if that person ever rises up and goes into, say, management, gives them other opportunities to be able to say, hey, I've had great experiences in this organization. I've worked in the restaurants. I've worked in housekeeping, and I can offer perspectives that allow me to do my job as a front desk manager, for example. So I think there's a great opportunity in doing internal candidates. External candidates, sometimes, and I always kind of look at it as, you do internal candidates. Internal candidates are kind of like your draft. If you want to take a football analogy, so you're and it kind of works out that way if you stick with me here. The draft, you kind of want your person that you're going to want to build up, and as that person grows and matures, you want them to work through the internal process in order to get things going. I always think of external candidate hiring as sort of your free agency. Holy smokes, I need a manager right now. The 3 people that I have that would feed into that manager are nowhere near ready to become managers. I'm going to go hire free agency. And then I'm going to go hire somebody else external to the organization. That's how it should happen. Now, of course, what ends up happening is there's a whole wide range of things, personality issues, other problems where people just basically say, you know what, I don't want to hire anybody within the organization. I'm going to hire external. Maybe I got a good friend that I want to have come work with me, and he's working at another organization. I want to bring him into this position and blah, 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 so on and so forth. Usually, and some organizations do this where they have the internal candidates competing with the external candidate. That I've never been a big fan of that. I've always said that you kind of need to have an idea as to, I always say promote from within. Promoting from within is always a good deal because you want to make sure that you have the opportunity to bring people into the, to really gel with the organization and really understand that, hey, if they're willing to promote me from within, they really do care about me, I'll stay at this organization for a long time. As opposed to if I have you working in housekeeping the whole time and you're working in housekeeping for 15 years straight, have I really helped the organization? And the answer to that is no. At least I don't believe it is. I always believe in internal referrals and internal hiring is a good thing. There's a table 5.1 that talks about advantages, disadvantages. I'm not going to go too much into this other than the fact that, one of the disadvantages, of course, is that if an internal candidate doesn't get the job, they're going to be upset. I have seen that happen before. I do see that, and I see that it improves morale more often than not. So I think it's something that should go. Talking about external candidates bringing new talent to the company, one thing that we love to do in the accounting industry is hire from outside. And one of the reasons why we like to do that is because sometimes we learn what other firms are doing by bringing that person in and then having them show us how they would prepare something. I've seen where this has benefited us in the past. And so in this section, we're going to talk about interviewing. And as part of this section, they're going to explain the various types of interviews and the interview questions, discuss interview methods and potential mistakes in interviewing candidates, and then explain the interview process. So, and they talk about, and this is, I love how they started this off, interviewing people costs money. I think what people forget is they're like, how can this cost money? All we're doing is sitting down and having a 30-minute conversation with somebody. Well, you got to pay somebody for that 30 minutes. In addition to that, setting up the interview takes time. Bringing all the players together in order to make something happen takes time. And it may not just be your interview time as an HR person, but you may also have other people who are going to be participating in the interview that are going to have their time as a result of it. And that it takes time. And so time is money. That's one thing. And then of course making sure that you've got the processes set up, that also takes time, and that is of course a money thing too. But just try to be respectful of that. Sometimes department managers are especially those who are budget crunched, don't usually want to spend a whole lot of time doing this stuff, and sometimes that's a place where we HR people can help out. So I talk about different types of interviews. The first one is the traditional interview. Come into my office, sit down. Would you like a cup of coffee? Yes. Oh, you would? Okay. So, at this level of my game, I'd say to whoever's working outside, hey, Mr. Smith, would you please go get a cup of coffee for our potential candidate? We start chatting it up. Coffee arrives. Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself. Why do you really want to work here? Blah, blah, blah. And then we just move into it. And there's a series of questions that happens. And like I said in the previous section, we could do a formal sort of, list of questions that we're going to do. Or what I could end up doing is an informal interview where it's just kind of shoot the bull. Whoops, almost got X-rated there. Where you just shoot the bull, and the next thing you know, you have a better idea as to what people are up to. You can then do the telephone interview. Telephone interview is, generally speaking, the reason why you're going to do a telephone interview. These are sort of generally used for selections, weeding out of people. The one thing that we want to do with telephone interviews is that, maybe conduct a 5-10 minute interview. We're going to ask like 3 or 4 questions, and depending on how they answer those 3 or 4 questions, we'll decide if they want to bring them in for a personal interview. It saves a lot of time for the person who has to drive in. It saves a lot of time. And I'm talking the person who has to drive in being the candidate. It also saves a lot of time for you, because you don't have to go get an office set up. Like for me, I have to clean my office. So that in and of itself can take about an hour. So it's one of those things that it saves a lot of time, and it allows us to sort of if I have a pool, say, of 30 candidates and I want to whittle it down to 5, I could use a telephone interview, bang all of those out, and the next thing you know, I've got it down to 5 based off of the based off of that. So you can do a panel interview. I've actually attended one of these when I did the JET program. I did a panel interview. There were 3 people. One of them was Japanese, who tested my Japanese before I went to Japan. And then we conducted the interview in Japanese, which I thought was interesting. It's the first time I'd ever done an interview in Japanese. I've done almost 100 of them since, because I used to go to these things called career forums, which they were both in the old days, around 2000 to 2003. They were actually located in 3 locations. There were 3 locations. I can't remember where the third one went to, but the 2 main locations that they had was San Francisco and what's the other one? Was it Boston? I think it was Boston. Now that I think about it, I think it was Boston. And the reason why they did that is because if you are a Japanese national who comes to the United States to go to school and you want to go back and get a job, well, they want to hire you. So what they do is they fly their people over here to do interviews. But it was also an opportunity that if you spoke Japanese like I did, I could go and get an interview. And the way they would do it is you initially started off with a thing that was like a telephone interview, but it was like a 5-minute conversation with the person in front. If they really liked you, they're like, okay, stand by. I'm going to go get the big boss, see if we can get you processed for the second interview. They yank you up to a hotel room. You sit down with usually one of the HR bosses, who then says, okay, this person's a fit. When I go back to Japan tomorrow, I'm going to bring your resume. I'm going to show it to the big boss and see if we can get an interview with you. That's kind of how that worked out. And it was a great experience. Of course, all my interviews had to be in Japanese, and that was tough sometimes, but not as much. Anyways, getting back to this. So the panel interview, you could have it to where there's 3, 4, or 5 people. Usually you see these for big jobs, though. Just because of the fact that it takes a lot of time. I mean, for every person who's there, that's time, that's money. So they can be very expensive, and so usually They're for people that if they really, really, really need somebody to you know, for like a higher level position. Information interview. Here's the thing, you know, and this is actually something it's not as much for you as an HR person, but you as a person who's going to be looking for jobs. One of the best things that you can do, my wife did this when she got laid off, I did this when I got laid off, but I also did this when I was looking around. I build a network of people, not just through LinkedIn. And a lot of people, they like to build these networks through LinkedIn, but here's what they like to do. They say they build this network with LinkedIn, and then they say, okay, now I want to go for another job. And so they say, okay, fine, I'm going to go get another job. And when you decide you're going to go get that another job, you call, you know, and you don't even call anymore. You just get on your LinkedIn account and you're like, oh, I noticed that IBM's hiring. My connection at LinkedIn, through LinkedIn at IBM is, you know, John Smith. I'll send John Smith a personal message, say, hey, I'm kind of looking to leap. There's a great position out there. Can we sit down and have coffee? And that's kind of how people have been doing it. I think that we've moved away from personality or network development, and I think that it's very important to build your network and keep your network growing as you you know, whether you move off like I did into my own business, but more importantly as you're going through your career, because you will never know when one day they're going to walk in and say, you know what, I got bad news, you don't work here anymore. And you know, for both me and my wife, it was for the exact same reason. Our company was being sold and they had to thin the herd. And it wasn't that we weren't qualified or weren't good enough to do our job. We were expensive. And so as a result of that, they sent us off. Now the good news is we landed. We're very happy where we are, and it, you know, it's a tough thing to go through, but build that network, because, you know, when I remember when I got laid off, I reached out to my network, who's hiring, and you know, it was solace in the beginning, because you knew you weren't alone. You knew that people knew that you could be looking for a new position, and so it was actually very helpful. I actually didn't find my third company that I went to go work for at that point. That was actually found through an interesting thing that I'll probably share with you guys later on. Meal interviews. This is where, you know, we talk about taking a candidate out to lunch or dinner. I don't see this happening as much anymore. People kind of, you know, there's too much reading into what's that happens. Oh my God, what if I go out to this meal interview and I order the steak instead of the salad? You know, I want to order the cheap food so I don't appear to be taking advantage of the company. I don't think you can ever do these right, in my opinion. So I always say, if you're doing a meal interview, it should be for a selection process, not for an actual promotion. Group interviews. This is where you might bring in several candidates all at once. Generally, this isn't going to happen if the selection is very subjective as much. You know, you're going to do this mostly with objective selection criteria, mostly because of the fact that you know, people are going to react in groups different than they're going to react individually, and you might not be able to always get the right questions. I've attended one of these once. I didn't really care for it, and I would never put somebody else through it again. Video interviews. I've actually been hearing a lot more of these happening. I've actually had a couple students at my other university that I work with who you know, reach out to me and say, hey, look, you know, this other big four that, you know, not my big four, but another big four, they wanted to do an interview, but it was a video interview. So they, you know, they would have, you know, send her the script. She would have to read the script and answer the questions as she could. You know, it's easier for them to sit there and watch, you know, 10 5-minute interviews or 5-minute videos than it is to bring, you know, 10 candidates in for a 5-minute interview, because you got to sit down, you got to be relaxed, you got to be, hi, how's it going, blah, blah, so on and so forth. Next thing you know, a 5-minute interview turns into a 10-15-minute interview, and then 10 interviews goes from 50 minutes all the way up to, you know, 150 minutes, which is a lot longer. That's almost 3 hours. Non-directive interviews, unstructured, like I said, that's kind of like sitting around shooting the bull. But you know, they you know, the candidate spends more time talking. You want to make sure that when you do an unstructured interview that you're using open questions. You don't want to say, you know, do you like beef? is a bad question, because yeah, I do. Now what? That doesn't help. But if you say, tell me about the first time that you ate a steak, that's when the person's going to be like, oh, okay, and then they have to go into this nice long story. You want open-based questions, and I'm only talking about steak right now because I haven't had one in about 4 days, so I'm actually kind of craving one. But that's between you and me. Interview questions they talk about. I like how they bring some of these additional sort of examples. I like to do a structured interview when you're trying to talk to a variety of candidates and try to select one, and then with the final interview kind of being an unstructured interview where they're talking to the person who's actually the hiring authority, and then from there we can go with that, and I think that tends to work out a little bit better. I'll let you look at this. They give to behavior description interviews, then they kind of talk about situational interviews. If you saw someone stealing from this company, what would you do? And of course, I don't know. I tend to be. Some of these are very interesting. I don't know if I'd ask that question just because, I mean, what's the person going to say? Well, I don't know, I'd look the other way. No, they're not going to do that. So I tend to be a little bit more, anyways, don't get me started. There's some interview questions which are illegal. Here's some examples. You cannot say, so for example, and I've actually almost gotten into trouble for this. I lived in Japan for years. I spoke Japanese. I speak Japanese. I speak some Chinese. I speak some German. And if I hear a name that sounds Japanese, German, Korean, or Japanese, German, Korean, Chinese, or even Vietnamese, I always kind of go, wow, that's interesting, and I always want to ask, are you from that country, or have you lived here your whole life and your family immigrated here years ago? That's something I just find fascinating, and obviously it's not because I'm going to tell somebody, oh, you can't work here, because obviously I love Asian culture, but again, I guess, this isn't something you should be asking. And so, never ask about first language. That is a big no-no. Do you have any language abilities that would be helpful in this job? Or are you authorized to work in the United States? Is an acceptable question, because you have the law. We talked about that in the last class, where you have to be able to verify somebody's workability. And that's not illegal. Now, I'd be careful about that because if somebody's a citizen and you're asking them this question because they have an accent, it could kind of be like, oh, yeah, of course but again, it's probably do it more diplomatically than it seems like here. Are you authorized to work in the United States? This should actually be something that should be on an application form that's part of the screening. They shouldn't be getting to an interview process if they don't have authorization to work in the United States. That's just between, that's just the way I feel about it. Age, you cannot ask someone how it's best to indicate the age. Other questions, when did you graduate from high school? Are you over 18 is acceptable. Over 18 is acceptable. When did you graduate from high school could be problematic. And I think this is always due to facts and circumstances. So, for example, and maybe I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but, very good example. Abilene High School. I went to Abilene High School. Boy, and you want to talk about pride in school. Normally, if you ran into somebody that graduated from the same college you did, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. We talk about all the stuff that happens. If I meet somebody who graduated from Abilene High School, it's like a fraternity, okay? we start talking about everything. I mean, I can't tell you the feeling it is. It's nuts. If you've seen the television show Friday Night Lights, it's like that. And I know if I was in an interview and somebody found out I went to Abilene High School, the first thing they're going to ask is, when did you graduate? And they're not asking because they want to disparage you or disparately impact your opportunity to get in. They want to know if you know the same teachers that they do. My personal, it's best to avoid the questions, but situation always dictates it. I know that some of my friends who went to the other school, Cooper High School, if they met somebody from Cooper, they're going to be talking about it. I mean, I remember when it was a big deal that the Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh, who's in the Supreme Court now, his wife went to Cooper High School. And I remember that was like big all over social media with all my friends. And, of course, some of us were making jokes, oh, she went to that high school, but, all in good fun and all kidding. But, it was kind of cool that somebody came from the same town that we are that was getting onto the national stage, no matter what you think about the whole Kavanaugh thing. I mean, his wife, going to our school was kind of cool for some of us for a while. Marital status. You can't ask direct questions about marital status or age of children. Do you have any restrictions on your ability to travel, since this might require a 50% travel? Is a perfectly acceptable question. Get back to the job description. So if the job description, they said, hey, look, it's 30% travel. We just want to make sure that you don't have any any restrictions on that. This would be the time that you would say, yeah, I have a phobia of planes. Okay, well, sorry, you're going to be traveling from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco every time. That's going to be a big thing. Now, it's illegal to ask candidates about their religious affiliation or ask how they may indicate a religious affiliated school or university. Again, this is an area that I that happens to me every now and then. I remember I was in an interview, and I only bring this up because I went to Gonzaga University, which is a Jesuit school, and during the interview, one of the guys doing the interview went to Marquette, and so I heard that I went to Gonzaga. He's like, you went to Gonzaga? I was like, yeah. He said, oh yeah, well, I went to Marquette. So, we knew we were both from Jesuit universities. I don't think it was illegal. I don't think he was worried. I mean, I got the job, so I wasn't all that concerned about it. But at the same time, obviously, it's probably something that shouldn't have been brought up. And the reason why he was bringing it up, of course, gets into this religion area. Disabilities. You may not directly ask a person if they have disabilities or recent illness. This is where we kind of get into, I was talking about this with the BFOQs, where you're going to sit down and you're going to say, hey, look, I need you to operate this machine. This machine requires, because you got to operate from two levers that are, and they're, far placed, spaced. You got to have two hands that work perfectly. You're not going to ask them, can you, what you're going to do is you're going to describe the work environment, and you're going to say, do you have any reason why you cannot perform that job? And if they come back and the guy says, well, and he shows you that his hand is gone, that's going to be, something that has to be considered. Now, is there a reasonable accommodation that could be used with that? If all he has to do is move something back and forth, maybe there's something that can be attached to that so that he can move his arm back and forth and still do the thing safely. Again, that's when you're starting to get into BFOQs. That's when you're starting to get into some really dangerous areas. You might want to make sure that legal advice is available before you have the interview with a person like that, if you know about it ahead of time. And if you don't know about it ahead of time, before you make a decision on whether you're going to hire that candidate or not, you better talk to legal counsel. And I don't care if I had 10 people. Of the 10 people, he was the worst qualified based on his answers in the interview. You still want to at least run it by legal counsel. Say, hey, this is the issue that we're running into. So what do you think? I'd rather have a 15-20 minute conversation with my lawyer than spend the next 3 months with him trying to defend myself in a court. Criminal record, it's perfectly fine to perform criminal record checks. Asking a candidate if they've ever been arrested is not appropriate, however, and this actually depends on the state. I know some states, I used to know Maryland pretty well, and I've fallen out of following with them lately. But they used to actually, a lot of states, asking if they had a felony ever is illegal. Other states, it's perfectly fine to ask. And that's why it's very important that you not only focus on the federal level of laws, which we always talk about in this class, but once you start doing your job, you want to get accustomed to what the state requirements are. Personal questions. Yeah, I mean, asking personal questions such as social organizations or clubs, unless they relate to the job. I'm a Freemason, so every time somebody sees my ring, they always bring it up. If they recognize what it is. But I think it's you as the interviewer do not want to ask. You want the interviewee to ask those kinds of things if that's going to happen, because that's going to be better. Any questions about weight, height, gender, arrest record, as opposed to allowable questions about criminal conviction, should be avoided. They talk about the halo, they call it a reverse halo effect. They used to call this in the old days, they used to call this the halo or the horn effect, where as you're doing selection, you focus on a specific aspect. So for example, say for example, a very good example. I'm hiring for a staff accountant, and I'm sitting across from somebody who I'm interviewing, and I notice that he has an Abilene High ring on. And I'm like, oh, wow, did you go to Abilene High? He said, yeah, I did. And of course, the first thing I want to ask is, what year did you graduate? Which is probably not what I should do. But then, I'll be like, oh, yeah, when were, you were at Abilene? He's like, yeah. I was like, did you do any, activities? Because, sports are always kind of like a big thing with Abilene High. So, yeah, I used to play football on Abilene High. Now you've got my attention, because I used to work with the football players a lot. So I had an immense amount of respect with the football players. There were several of my friends who were members of the football team, and so as a result of which now, so when I'm considering other people for the staff position, something I might be thinking in my mind is, good old Abilene High guy. And maybe I'm going to consider him over other people because I know he went to the same high school I did. That's a bias, okay? And that's a bias, and some people would basically are probably nodding there saying, yeah, well, I understand that, blah, 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 so on and so forth. But then there's other people who can kind of take a look at it and say, well, wait a minute, Kevin, if you know who that person is, and you know that they were on the football team, they probably have a certain cultural aspect to them. Maybe you know that they're going to fit in your organization better. So you kind of have to be very, very careful about halo horn effects, just because, and a good example of a horn effect is, if I find out the person went to Cooper High School, and I'm like, oh, wow, I those Cooper guys, I don't know if I really want to, bring them in. I would never do that, but that's the last thing that you ever want to have happen, is that something that's completely unrelated to the job process, and you're making decisions based off of that, which is very detrimental to the person. Then there's a contrast bias, which is a type of bias in comparing one candidate to another. And then there's gut feeling bias, where you're going on intuition. Hasty generalizations, we used to talk about these all the time, and then similar to me bias, and then my favorite, the recency bias. I've seen so many times where the last guy that gets interviewed usually gets bonus points because he's the most recently looked at, which is ludicrous. There's no reason why that should be happening. So the interview process, once a criteria has been selected, time to start interviewing people, and then you recruit your candidates, establish criteria, set timeline for the interview and the decision making. All of this stuff should be set up in advance, and there's that list you just want to make sure that you follow. Some things to consider. They say make sure that everyone is trained on the interviewing process. Once you develop the process, the most important thing is to make sure that everybody understands how the process is going to be handled. You know, what you don't want, what you also want to make sure, and they kind of talk about it, I don't know why they're talking about it here, about the interview process, assuming that they're talking about the interview process that you've set up. But then there's also some things you need to cover in, you know, when you're bringing people in, is, you know, talking to them about illegal questions. And that's why I said, you know, before anybody gets into an interview, they should probably attend a training where they can talk about, hey, these are just some illegal questions we don't want to be asking people. Listen to the candidate, develop a rapport, be realistic about the job. Don't talk about all the great things you're going to do, because what ends up happening is then the person gets there and they're kind of like, well, and I've had this happen to me, where people will sit down and tell me anything that I want to hear about, oh, yeah, you'll definitely be considered for promotion after 1 year. And then, you know, if you don't make it that year, you're definitely going to probably make it in the following year. And that sets up unrealistic expectations. That happens in the accounting industry all the time. Stick to your questions for hiring, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in this section, we're going to talk about testing and selecting. You want to be able to explain the types of tests that can be administered as part of the process, and be able to discuss the types of selection models. Okay, so besides the interview, we can look at other aspects. Testing is one of them, and they give you major categories of the test. You got the cognitive abilities test, the personality test, physical abilities test, job knowledge requirements, and a work sample. I'll tell you what, I've done a lot of things, and I mean, I've seen physical ability tests, mostly when we're talking about people being able to do certain actions. Job knowledge tests, maybe. I've not seen too many of these other ones. I mean, the military uses personality and cognitive ability tests, but that's pretty much the only organization I've ever seen that's ever done that. Cognitive ability test, they give an example of the SAT. So, you know, after taking, okay, so they did talk about it, okay, and I'm kind of glad they bring this up. So they talk about the cognitive ability tests that can have disparate impact when they did EEOC versus Ford and the United Automobile Workers of America, where they said black Americans were rejected from the apprentice program after taking a cognitive test known as the ATSS. And one of the things that they run into when they build these tests is that many times there's a cultural understanding that sometimes gets lost in translation, and that's what they kind of run into. You know, I mean, if anybody were to try to convince me that, you know, black Americans and white Americans have, you know, different culture, I mean that's kind of like a no kidding moment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible to be tested. It's just that cultural difference sometimes has to be understood, and, you know, like the ways they word the questions, the way they phrase the questions. And sometimes they don't do that, and as a result of which, guess what happens? You have the fact that you know, people aren't being selected for it, and as a result of which, Ford lost $8.5 million. That's why, and nowadays I think they've gotten a lot better. The Myers-Briggs, the Big Five personality factors, I think are a little bit better with that. But I remember early IQ tests would always have that problem, is that it always depended upon cultural understanding, because they'd give you a problem that you have to solve. And if you didn't have a cultural understanding of that problem, you know, very good example, sometimes big city people have different cultural understandings than country folk do. So if they're building it off the big city folk, guess what? The country folk's going to look like a blithering idiot. Or vice versa. You know, if I sit there and talk to somebody about, you know, how to deal with, you know, a farming problem, you know, I could take a person who's in Brooklyn, New York, put them out on a farm, they're going to look like a blithering idiot. So there's a lot of things that have to kind of go into this. One of the things that I've learned going through my doctoral program that I'm going through, it's that, you know, a lot of these you know, tests have to go through rigorous testing standards and validation, and so that's what you need to make sure that you've used a test that has done that, that can eliminate a lot of that cultural bias. Then they also talk about EEOC versus Dow Corporation, women were disproportionately rejected for entry-level positions. Yeah, and that's definitely a no-no. Once the interview is complete and testing occurs, other methods of KSOAs, including checking references, driving records, can be performed. Yeah, and some companies use Facebook. I mean, this is, I told you this in the previous video, guys. If you're going out for a job interview, make sure your Facebook account is clean. You know, I have seen many a time where we were going through a Facebook account of a candidate, and we were like, we do not want this person working here. We had, you know, pictures of you know, weird stuff. You know, and it's not necessarily illegal stuff, but it's just embarrassing stuff. You see a person doing a keg stand, for example, and you're hiring for, say, a professional law firm. I mean, it just doesn't look good. You know, so you sometimes want to make sure that you have it done. Although there are some people, some lawyers I've met that actually probably would be an acceptable hiring thing, only because some of the lawyers I know are pretty rambunctious. Yeah, and you want to make sure that all these, and here's the big picture, and I can go over this over and over and over again, but I think it's just going to be repetitive. Big picture thing, don't use a test unless it's relevant to the job. Okay, so if you're going to hire an accountant, you can do a math test. You know, I would think that if they have a master's degree in accounting, they probably would have passed enough math tests, but if you want to give them a math test, that's probably something that could be reasonable. If you want to test their knowledge of the code section, because they're going to be a tax accountant, that's fine. You're going to hire a lawyer, you want to test their section, you know, their knowledge of the law in the area you're going to be practicing, that's fine. You know, but if you're going to be hiring somebody from McDonald's and you want to, you know, you want to give them a, you know, a test for, you know, reading complex manuals. I mean, I don't think you're going to get a lot of people who are going to say that's right. So, and you're going to get rid of people that, quite frankly, may actually do better for your organization than you give them credit for. Talking about selection methods, you know, a clinical selection is probably the best way. The most common selection involves all the, you know, those who make the decisions. Statistical method, bigger organizations tend to use this because it requires the kind of development of complex statistical models, or use of programs, specialized programs that you can actually purchase for off the shelf or through companies that do. That basically, and what they do with like the statistical averages, and I've seen one of these before, where it, you know, they're going to come in, they're going to analyze your job, and they're going to give it certain weights. Okay. In addition to that, they can take the factors that you are giving to your candidates, and they can compare them to a population sample. So, for example, if I'm going to ask people, say, about, you know, their ability to work on, you know, and I'm going to test them based on the ability to use the tax code section. If the company's big enough and they've done enough of these, and they work with several other companies, what they'll do is they'll say, hey, look, of the 10 people that you've hired, this person was number one. However, this person, compared to the population of the people that we've been testing across the entire spectrum, you know, he's in the bottom third, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a lot. I think, you know, and it's interesting. I know one of the big four, KPMG, is spending uber amounts of money on data analytics. I think data analytics is going to be a huge opportunity if it's something that you find interesting. People who understand business processes, but at the same time can analyze data, I think is going to be something that's very important. Yeah, and they kind of talk about, you know, like I said, you know, they talk about the differences, and I've kind of gone a little bit into it. Okay, multiple cutoff model is you know, requires that a candidate have a minimum score in all selection criteria. You know, and this is, and we kind of talk about this in assignment 1, where they're going to have different scores that they're going to have for people, and there's certain things that they're going to do that you know, you're basically going to look at and you're going to say, okay, you know, I have you know, I'm going to put these different criteria that I'm going to have, and there's going to be a minimum score, and if they don't meet that minimum score, they're not going to be considered. And so, you know, that's something that you could do too. Sometimes that makes it to where it takes out the objective. I mean, it makes it objective. It takes out the subjectiveness of certain things. But, you know, I don't think any model's perfect. So, you know, I think that there's definitely some other things that they can do with that. So they give you a sample selection model, figure 5.4. I would read over that, and that'll give you kind of a good idea as to what's happening there. All right, so in this section, we're going to talk about making the offer, and the learning objections is explain the steps making the offer to the candidate. Okay, most fascinating time that I've had was telling somebody that they're hired, that they're going to get selected for something. It's wonderful. You see the light in their face. They're extremely happy, and it's exciting. It's exciting work, and I loved hiring people. I loved hiring people. You know, and telling people they were going to get hired, and that's great. So some of the things that, you know, one of the problems that we run into is the salary, and they kind of talk a little bit about this in the beginning of this. You know, obviously you want to offer a salary that's going to be competitive, that's going to convince the person to come join your organization. Now, obviously, you know, different facts and circumstances are going to do this. If the person's unemployed, you might be able to get away with a smaller salary. Now, remember, we work for the company, not for the individual that we're going to be hiring. Some of the stuff that I'm going to say, you know, in the next few minutes might sound a little impersonal, but you have to appreciate where it's coming from in order to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. And not to suggest that, you know, it's a good idea to take advantage of people, but it is going to be, you know, you have to take into all sorts of different factors. If the person's working for, say, a major organization and you want to bring them to your smaller company, you better understand why that person's making that leap. And then you can tailor your package towards that. That's a very good example of that. You may have a person who basically says, okay, and go back to my example where I talked about somebody's unemployed and you're bringing them in, and you might want to offer a smaller salary, but here's what you can do up front. I'll give you a $6,000 bonus. You sign on the dotted line right now. Or $6,000 bonus if you sign and accept within the next day or two. That's phenomenal for somebody who's unemployed, because guess what? If they're unemployed and they've been unemployed for a while, they might be racking up some bills, you know? So I don't think it's necessarily bad for that to happen. Okay, so in this section, we're going to be talking about making the offer. We'll explain this, and you know, the learning objective here is actually pretty self-explanatory. It says explain the steps of making the offer. You know, and the first thing they kind of jump into is sort of the salary. But before I begin talking about that, let me talk about making the offer. I love this part of the job process, the job selection process, because what ends up happening is it's exciting to tell somebody that they're being hired. You see the glow on their face, especially if you're telling them in front of them. You know, but then it kind of comes to the stressful part. What is it that I'm going to offer this person in order to make them come to my organization? Now, it's going to depend on the situation. If the person's unemployed, they're going to have a different set of expectations than if somebody is working for, say, a larger company. Okay, so if they're working for, you know, if they're unemployed, I'm not suggesting that you take advantage of people, because I guarantee you this. And look, I will tell you this from personal experience. I was laid off once, and I was brought into an organization, and they lowballed it. And within 6 months, I had to go back to them and say, look, I think I got lowballed a little bit. I've worked my butt off here for the past 6 months. I think I need to go back to market rates. And they were willing to do it. And I think that, because they realized it. But some things that you can do if you want to have an overall lower cost of an employee. So maybe, for example, compensation is not our leading factor. Okay. Like, for example, my firm, when I build it, I'm going to be a compensation lagger, benefits leader. So if I have somebody who's coming to my organization that was was laid off and has been laid off for, say a couple months, I can offer a bonus to begin with. Well, I pay you a bonus to come work for us. And as long as you don't leave the company for the next 3 months, you get to keep the bonus. That's huge. That's something, somebody may be willing to accept a smaller offer if they're able to get a bonus up front. Something else that could be done, this is where I kind of get into this. Everybody wants to focus on the salary number. And the salary, obviously it's important, but it's not the end-all be-all. It depends on your presentation. And I've always been of the mindset that I always start off with the total rewards compensation package that is not the salary. Because once you've told the person the salary, they're done. They've already made up their mind as to whether they like the salary or not. If they think it's being lowballed, they're not going to hear a word that you said about how wonderful everything is afterwards. And if they think that they're being highballed, they're not going to care about anything you said afterwards, because they're going to be like, I'm going to say yes anyways. They're just not going to be listening. So I usually try to talk about, we offer a detailed compensation package. First of all, our health insurance is one of the best is the best. It's considered a Cadillac plan under the Affordable Care Act. All this different stuff that we throw out there, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So you do that. It's kind of it's kind of a way that you can actually offer that. Now, in talking during the interview, and the thing that, I told you that there are certain things that boil my blood. One of the things that boils my blood is when a person wants to ask a potential candidate, how much are you making? I can't stand that. And here's the reason why. I should know generally what they're making based on what the market research says. And here's the thing. If the person's talking to me, there's something about that company they're not happy with. It's either A, they're not happy with the salary they're making, in which case, if they're not happy with the salary that they're making, and you find out that they're making a very low salary, and you offer them a low salary, guess what you've done? You've shot yourself in the foot. Okay. But there may be other things, and maybe they're very happy, very upset with the company, but they love their salary. And so now they've told you what the salary is, and then maybe it goes above your expectations. Now you're kind of like, well, I don't know if I want to hire this guy anymore. Okay. The other thing that you have to understand is most states, and I can't think of any state that I know of right off the top of my head, it's illegal for them to call your other company and the other company to disclose the salary. They won't do it. So theoretically, your candidate could say whatever number they want, because you can't verify it unless you're asking them for a copy of their tax returns for some reason, which if you're going to ask them for a copy of their tax returns, you better have a good reason for it. But other than that, I don't, I just think it's a perilous question. I don't think it brings value, and that just might be me. Now they said, at what point dollar-wise would you accept our job offer? Dollar-wise, would you reject our, accept our job offer or reject our job offer? I think that's a fair question to ask. What are your salary expectations? I'm a little bit better with. But what kind of salary are you making at the company? And what really boils my blood is when I'm applying to a company and they ask this in the resume section, of the computer program. They're saying, how much are you making at this company? And they're asking you for your detailed salary history, and you're kind of like, why do you need to know this? But here's the thing, they make it an asterisk, so if I don't provide it, I can't move forward. I've been put out to companies like that. I don't like to discuss it. And so You know, in my personal opinion, if they're going to be asking my entire salary history, it's because they're too lazy to find out what the salary is for the market as a whole. But that's just me personally. If the interview does not respond away, clarify by asking. I'm asking this because I'm going to gauge your interest level. You know, like I said, I don't personally care to ask this. In my opinion, you ask what you find out what the, you know, like I said, and they give you a list of this, and I'm actually pretty happy. What's the scarcity of the particular skill set? What are the going wages in this area? What are the current economic conditions? What's the current pay for the similar positions in your organization? Blah, 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 so on and so forth. You take all these factors in, you don't need to ask them their salary. There's no reason to ask. And like I said, I don't think that it's something we should be doing. And it really does make me a little unhappy with that. These are some things that they give you for tips for successful negotiating of the salary. You know, be prepared to know exactly. You know, there's always the you know, sort of the idea that you would say, you know, go in with, you know, ask for your dream but settle on realistic expectations. And be remembered that you know, you want the candidate as much as they want you. Okay, but you do have the advantage. You know, especially if the candidate's already indicated that they're very happy with it. Unless it's a tight labor market. If it's a tight labor market, you're going to have to offer more. Okay, they say here, discuss the entire offer. That's where I say put up the benefits first and then talk money. Okay, be able to provide salary research for the same title. I'm going to share this with you guys. I had an interview once, and I'm not going to name the company because I don't want to embarrass them. But I had a company that was they were asking me to come work for them as a pretty high level person. You know, and they said, look, here's what we're going to give you. We're going to give you a great, you know, we want to, you know, we're going to provide you with health insurance, and then we're also going to provide, you know, some other things. And then here's the salary that we want to give you. And the salary was probably about $30,000 less than the going market rate for that position. I think this position I was interviewing for, it was $120,000 for the going rate, and they wanted to offer me, I think it was like $85,000. I mean, it was just, I sat there and was like, wow, how insulting can you get? And one of the things that it kind of burned me, because I went back to them and I said, well, first of all, I asked them about the health insurance. They said, oh yeah, you're going to have to pay 50% of your health insurance. I'm like, wow, these guys are really blowing this. And I said, well, this is not. I said, I'm sorry, this is way unacceptable. I said, for the level that you're asking me to work for, I think, 120 to begin with, plus, incentive package, plus, and then what they didn't realize is that they were talking to a guy who was a compensation expert, because they weren't hiring me for a compensation expert, they were hiring me as an accountant. And so I went back to them, and so they came to me and they said, look, this is the average salary that's being offered for your position, and here it is. And so they gave me this salary research that had been done. And they told me where they got it from. And so I went and I downloaded it. And this is something that you guys should learn from. I went and I downloaded the exact same research. And they were right. $85,000 was the average for the nation, not for the Washington, D.C. metro area. And it specifically said in the thing, for various localities, we have a multiplier that you must use. You go down to Washington, D.C. metro area, and the multiplier multiplied out, and it was at $120,000. And I pointed this out to them. And then they came back to me and said that they didn't think that that was the right salary. Well, needless to say, I walked away. They came back to me about 6 months to a year later, asked me if I was still interested, to which I was like, have you changed your mind on the salary? And they're like, no. And I said, no. I'm not interested. So it was an interesting conversation, to say the least. You know, they say that, talk about, you know, when you come in with salary research, make sure it's based on the locality that you're in, which usually if you use somebody like salary.com, it will be, because they're going to ask you your location that you're going to be doing. So once the phone call is made, candidate accepts the offer. An email or formal letter should follow. I always send the formal offer. I always send the informal offer by email, and then once they come back to me and they accept, it's all in writing. And then the second thing I do is I tell them, hey, look, we're going to have a formalized letter that's going to go out to you in the post, and we make sure it gets there within a day or two. And these are the things that they recommend that they have. You know, job title, salary, benefits, other compensation such as bonuses and stock options, benefits, vacation time, start date, non-compete agreement expectations, and additional considerations. Once the pay and benefits have been negotiated and offer sent, you should clarify acceptance details in writing and receive confirmation of the start date. It's not, need a month. Yeah, some people, they say for higher level positions, they need a month or two to transition from their old jobs. Some of these guys, if you're looking for like directors, they don't just walk in and say, here's my 2-week notice, I'm gone. They need to parse it off. Okay. And they're going to kind of expect that from there. Okay, guys, that's all I got for this section. Chapter 5 on selection. If you're not in my class and you have any questions, go ahead and write a comment in the comment box below. If you are in my class, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be very happy to reach out to you and talk to you about any questions that you might have. Again, I'm not getting a whole lot of emails, so I'm kind of figuring everything's modus operandi. But I'm very happy to hear from you at any time. Thank you very much.